So welcome everybody to the second lecture of this week. Before we get into landscape epidemiology, the topic for today, we are going to do a bit of a recap from what we were talking about yesterday, where we left things yesterday. So yesterday when we ended, we were talking about this third principle of disease ecology. So a third principle of ecological factors that influence the way that diseases are transmitted. And so this third principle had to do with niches. And as a recap, a niche is a set of biotic and abiotic conditions in the environment that define a species limit and their ability to survive in that given environment. So I did want to talk about an example just to sort of highlight why this is an important concept and why this is something that you definitely want to remember from yesterday's lecture on disease ecology. So in this example, this was a study on anthrax. So anthrax is caused by a deadly spore-forming bacteria called Bacillus anthracis. And anthrax, as some of you may know, is also used in a lot of bioterrorist attacks. It can be used as this sort of biological warfare because it is so deadly and so potent. But it does occur naturally in the environment in many places, but it's mostly present in regions of the world where there's a very dry, arid environment. And it can live in environmental hosts. And then when the animals die, sometimes humans may come into contact with those dead animals, whether that's with a carcass or whether it's with an animal that they're using for animal products, for leather, for example. And so there's many ways that humans can actually accidentally just stumble upon anthrax naturally in the environment. But something that researchers were a little bit concerned about was that they discovered this new emergent type of pathogen that was related to anthrax, but not completely identical to anthrax. And so they called this new emergent version BCBVA. Now they noticed that this particular type of the bacteria only really existed in primates. So that was the main host that they found it in, and it was mostly in humid forests. So different environment, luckily. One was found mostly in drier, arid regions. The other is more in humid forests. But, because anthrax is such a deadly type of bacteria, a deadly pathogen, scientists were worried, well, we don't know that much about this new emergent type of bacteria. Is there ever a potential time when these two could both pose a threat to people who are living in this part of the world? So they weren't sure. So they asked themselves, could both of these bacteria occur at the same time in the same place? And could that potentially lead to more deaths among human hosts? So essentially what they were asking here is, did those niches overlap between the two pathogens, right? Do they have a similar enough overlap in potential environmental or biotic conditions even in terms of whether the environment is able to sustain both at the same time? So this is something that they wanted to explore. And so these researchers modeled the environmental conditions, so things like temperature, humidity, vegetation, the acidity in the soil, and they identified specific environments, so both biotic and abiotic factors that they were looking at, also known as these niches. And they saw that both bacteria types could actually survive in some localized areas where there was an overlap in terms of these environmental conditions. So they found that they could both survive in these transition zones between sort of the drier, arid savannas and the more humid forests. Now, why would this be important? Why did they care about that? Well, as I said, one version is very, very deadly, very potent, and they don't really know enough about this new emerging BCBVA. And so scientists obviously would like to know if there's a potential that both could be a huge cause of death in the future. They definitely want to know for surveillance where they might expect to find an overlap in both of these pathogens, just so that if any humans are in the environment, perhaps doing hunting or things like that in those specific locations, then they should obviously be aware of potential threats like these potential pathogens in the environment. So that just hopefully illustrates the importance of these niches and why it's a huge part of disease ecology, why scientists are very interested in knowing these limiting factors in terms of where a given species can survive and where the overlaps might happen between different species, so where niches might be overlapping. Now, I want to bring this up from also last lecture where we talked about species diversity. So remember that we were talking about species diversity playing a very important role in infectious disease transmission. And we said that more diversity actually equals less density. So I want to ask you guys, based on that, does that mean more or less transmission of diseases? What do you guys think? If we have more diversity, do you think that's going to equal to more or less transmission of diseases? So some of you are saying yes, some of you are saying more. For those of you saying one or the other, do you want to just give me a quick reason why you're saying less, why you're saying more? What is your gut telling you here? Depends on the diversity of hosts or vectors or pathogens. Yeah. And so why might that diversity translate to more or less transmission of diseases? Different genetics in different species, so not all pathogens will be suitable to infect all. And Cassandra, are you saying yes or more or less? I guess I could scroll up if you've already answered the question. So for those of you saying less, Lamisa says less density would lead to less contact with other species to transmit the disease. Exactly, yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of you got this. So more diversity means more species, which means usually less transmission of diseases, because the more diversity you have, the less density you have, the more that these species sort of keep the populations in check, right? We talked about also this idea of predator-prey relationships yesterday. So the more diversity you have, the more that different species are interacting with each other in terms of competitive nature for different resources in an environment. So usually that would equal less density, and usually that would mean less transmission of diseases. So let's take a look at this relationship in a little bit more detail. So this is an example with Lyme disease. And so usually we would say if there's less biodiversity in a given forest ecosystem, where Lyme disease is usually quite prevalent, especially in the sort of northeastern part of the States, as well as Southern Ontario. So less biodiversity in these types of forests usually equals more Lyme disease. This is because when biodiversity is lost in an ecosystem, usually it's the resilient lower order species that end up kind of surviving and thriving. So what I mean by that are species like rodents, mice, rats. So those are the ones that tend to stay. They're very resilient, even if the environment isn't necessarily a great environment for higher order species. And so these are the species that tend to really amplify transmission of a lot of infectious diseases. So consider this example with Lyme disease. If an infected black tick were to hop on an opossum and tries to bite an opossum, opossums are actually really good at grooming themselves, and they end up killing a significant portion of the ticks that they encounter. So that's why here you can see that after a tick has sort of been dealt with an opossum, there's actually very few of them that are left that are still infected and that are still looking for the next host, a potential human host to encounter. Whereas if the tick encounters a mouse, then the mice are not as good at grooming themselves and killing the ticks, but also they are just smaller hosts. And so it's much more likely that the tick will not be fully fed, they'll drop off. And if they are an infected tick, they'll still be looking for that potential next human host or another animal host. So this goes to show that, the more biodiversity you have, especially the more higher order species you have, generally that tends to reduce the transmission of a disease such as Lyme. Let's look at that again. So another sort of key point to take away from this is this thing that we call the dilution effect. And I think someone may have touched on this in the comments, because the more biodiversity you have, the more that this reduces density and the more that that dilutes the kind of pool of competent hosts that, let's say in this example, a tick would want to encounter. So in this example, if you add a deer in the mix of different species in the ecosystem, well, deer are very large mammals. And so the tick is actually, oops, oh boy. The tick is actually much more likely to be fully fed after it's kind of had a meal on a deer. And so that results in less infected ticks. But as we said, if it was only a mouse in the ecosystem, then it's much more likely that you'll keep having these infected ticks, which could then spread the Lyme disease to humans. So this is why usually more biodiversity is a good thing. Now, one more example of this. So in addition to the dilution effect, which we just saw, another important key there is this encounter reduction. And I think someone may have also mentioned this in the comments, that when you have less density, then usually species are not bumping into each other. There's going to be less of that risk of transmission between species. And so in this example, we see something called the hantavirus, which is a virus that is particularly prevalent among rodent species, but it does occasionally infect humans. But it's definitely not the preferred host. Usually rodents are the key host. And so as you can see here, what they found in the study was that the more biodiversity they had in an ecosystem, the less prevalent this infection of hantavirus was in deer mice. So again, this is because of that encounter reduction. So when you have less mingling between members of even the same species, then there's just going to be less transmission of potential pathogens between those individuals of that population. So this brings us finally to today's topic. Today's topic is about landscape epidemiology. So we're moving away from a lot of those ecological species interactions, those types of things that we talked about yesterday. And today the focus is really on those landscape factors. So landscape epidemiology examines the dynamics of those host vector pathogen populations over particular spatial features. So what that means is really the physical environment, the landscape, and how those abiotic factors impact the spread of disease. So not just the species themselves, but also those abiotic factors in the environment. Now, what are examples of landscape features that might impact disease transmission? What do you guys think? What are potential landscape features? Mountains and oceans. Any others that would impact disease transmission? Rivers. Any others? If you think about COVID, something might come to mind as well. Does this include man-made features? That's interesting. Technically, yes, because obviously humans have changed the landscape in pretty substantial ways. And we will talk a little bit about that towards the end of today's lecture and into next week's lectures. So yeah, that's a really good question. Landscape can be both natural and man-made. Anyone else want to chime in? Animals in the environment. Yeah, so those species interactions, remember, are more of those ecological factors, but you're right. In general, I mean, these things are all tied together, so they do all influence one another. Residential areas, yeah. So maybe you're thinking of things like urbanization. That would definitely, yeah, exactly, Christiga, urbanization. Okay, yeah, so you guys got some examples there. Some others include things like vegetation, soil, even geology, hydrology. So some of you said water features, and yeah, definitely things like rivers, hydrology, the climate system, even your latitude or your elevation, right? That influences things like temperature, which is another important abiotic factor. Bye, Regina. Have a good day.
Have a good lecture.
So this brings us to these abiotic factors. So this is going to be really the focus of the rest of today's class, discussing these different factors and how they are also a really important part of a pathogen's niche, because not only do biotic factors influence where a species might be found in time and space, but also, of course, abiotic factors are really, really important. So in this particular figure, it's showing the abiotic factors up here and the biotic factors down here of this particular parasite, and the importance of these various factors on its survival in order to come to maturation. So this first example is temperature. Temperature is a really, really important abiotic factor that influences a lot of disease transmission. Pathogens, as you can probably guess, do require a really narrow, suitable temperature to thrive, to replicate, to grow and spread, usually. Some are a little bit more resilient in the environment. And not only that, but hosts and vectors also require specific temperatures to survive. So if a given host is not in the same niche as the pathogen, then they won't be able to interact. There won't be that overlap in niches, and the pathogen won't spread to that host. Now, an example of this in this figure here, this is for Legionella, which is a bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease, which is a type of pneumonia. And it's one of those kind of rare pathogens that has a really broad temperature range for suitable growth. So it can actually survive in temperatures between about 20 to 60 degrees Celsius, which is a very large range for a lot of pathogens. Most of them don't have such a large range. And so this makes this particular bacteria particularly resistant or persistent rather in the environment. It can really thrive in a number of different locations. So one example are water towers, especially on buildings that are used to cool buildings down. There have been quite a few outbreaks from that due to Legionnaire's, the bacteria Legionella that have caused Legionnaire's disease. Now, another one is body temperature. So I don't know how often you guys have maybe tried to test your body temperature over the course of the last year. Maybe you're feeling a little sick one day and you thought, oh no, do I have a fever? But has anyone ever noticed that your body temperature doesn't actually usually read 37 degrees Celsius? There's a reason for that. The temperature of the human body has actually been declining over time. So when they first established this average temperature of the human body, it was close to 200 years ago, back in the 1800s. And since then, they've noticed that the temperature of humans has been declining over time. Any guesses for why that might be? Anyone want to throw in a guess? Why might we be cooling down? We're more lazy now, adapting to climate change. Is that inversely related to global warming? Okay, interesting. So you guys are talking a lot about the change in kind of environmental temperatures, adapting to warmer weather. Anyone else? So remember that even though the planet is overall warming, our own kind of climate controlled environment has actually been cooling over time. Most of us, especially in the developed world, have access to things like air conditioning. And so we're not actually exposed to those warmer temperatures a lot of the time. Unfortunately, a lot of our studies on the human body temperature are also predominantly in more developed nations. So, we're collecting data usually from the context of the industrialized world and not other countries where maybe they don't have as much access to things like air conditioner. But another big reason why scientists think that our bodies are cooling down is because we're actually fighting fewer infections. If you think about it, even 200, 100, maybe even 50 years ago, there were just many more infections that us humans would encounter in our day-to-day life because of things like poor housing, poor sanitation. And so scientists think that overall our bodies tended to be a little bit warmer because they were more likely to be actively sort of on the lookout to fight infections. So they were a little bit more prepared. And because we just encounter few of those, that it's likely that our bodies have kind of adjusted and been able to cool down a little bit over time. Now, why does that matter? Why am I bringing this up? Well, the human body was actually evolutionarily engineered to be around 37 degrees Celsius or a little bit below that. So if you think about this, after the dinosaur era, when mammals emerged as the main kind of species on the planet, right? There were reptiles, there were other species, but the mammals really came out on top. Scientists think that it's actually because of our human body temperature. So they think that humans were uniquely positioned, particularly to become this sort of dominant species because we had this thermal resistance against a lot of fungal diseases because our body temperature was quite a bit higher than other species like reptiles. Now, why is it at exactly around 37 degrees? It's because any higher temperature would have severe metabolic costs. So we would have to eat a lot more in order to stay warm. And if our body temperature was lower, well, we wouldn't have as great of an ability to actually fight off infections. So they think that that's why the human body temperature is so kind of strictly regulated to be around that range of temperature. Now, another important abiotic factor is precipitation. So rainfall is actually one of the main environmental factors that impact drinking water quality. And I can see in this figure here, this is a figure from a study that was done in Sweden, and they were testing the E. coli levels in a river after a precipitation effect. So what they found was that usually about 48 hours after a rainfall event, that signaled the highest levels of the bacteria E. coli in the river. This is because, of course, it does take some time for the rainfall to sort of accumulate and flow into the watershed. So usually it takes about 2 days, depending on the size of the watershed, to fully collect and enter the river system. Of course, runoff from nearby land or farms or sewage systems can also enter water systems, aquifers, streams, and rivers. And so that can also severely impact people's drinking water quality. And so I don't know if any of you have ever been swimming in Lake Ontario or one of the other big lakes in Southern Ontario, but you will actually usually find signs that say that you should avoid swimming if there's been a significant rainfall event or a storm in the last 48 hours. And this is exactly why, because usually the levels of bacteria such as E. coli tend to be really, really high around that period of time. So around 48 hours after a big storm. Now, another important factor is humidity, so closely related to precipitation. And humidity has an interesting impact on pathogens because any pathogen that might be airborne will be impacted by the amount of water in the air. So in this particular study, they were looking at how precipitation and humidity impacted two viruses, rotavirus and norovirus. And what they found was the increase in rainfall and humidity was actually associated with fewer rotavirus, but an increase in rainfall and humidity signaled an increase in norovirus. So they had opposite kind of trends, right? One was decreasing over time, one was increasing. So what they believe is because rotavirus tends to be transmitted through aerosols. And so rotavirus would be particularly impacted by the level of humidity in the air, whereas something like the norovirus, which tends to be transmitted in water, it would be less impacted by humidity, but maybe a big rainfall event would impact it, because if it was in a stream system, if it was in a river, then a significant rainfall event would probably increase the transmission from that. So this is to say that pathogens do have different humidity needs, in addition to rainfall being a significant factor that might influence disease transmission. Now, another factor is, of course, air. Many pathogens do utilize the airborne transmission route, which is an indirect pathway compared to something like physical contact, which we talked a little bit about yesterday. So usually a pathogen will travel via droplets to infect a new host. This is the case with something like tuberculosis and most likely COVID, although there is this sort of question mark nowadays with COVID in terms of whether it can become an airborne virus in some unique circumstances. But so this is to say that, yes, the airborne transmission route is a pretty important one for many pathogens. It's also worth noting that air contaminants also are, of course, a concern, less so for communicable infectious diseases, more so for chronic diseases, things like asthma. But of course, they do also utilize the airborne transmission route for non-pathogens as well. So this brings us to vegetation. Can humans catch diseases from plants? What do you guys think? Can we catch a disease from a plant? Most of you are saying yes. Anyone saying no? Interesting. An overwhelming yes from the group. So in reality, very rarely, Sunima said no. Okay, so one outstanding no. Yeah. So very rarely, and this is because humans do have a very different set of genes compared to plants, whereas we are much more similar to animals. So that's why it's possible for pathogens to jump from animal to animal, but less likely for them to jump from plants to animals like humans. But this isn't to say that vegetation isn't important, because as we know, vegetation can really influence the spread of species. Vegetation is a really important factor that influences the niche of a particular species. So plant communities are really important in terms of where pathogens might be found because of the ecosystem that they are a part of. And so things like fungus, bacteria, those are particularly impacted by a vegetation type. And interestingly, actually, in this study, they were comparing the ecosystem in Texas, so scrublands, as they are called in Texas, compared to the grasslands in Africa. And they found that the environmental conditions, the vegetation and the soil, were very similar. And this is why, actually, the bacteria Anthrax can be found in some locations in Texas, right? It's a very similar kind of arid, dry environment. And so it can have this overlap in niche in both continents, even though they are very different. Would this not include agricultural vegetation then? What do you mean by that, Reed?
I'll just go on the mic. It's a little bit easier to explain.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Just the instance, I guess, of food poisoning or E. coli or salmonella that people contract from, I think lettuce is a big one. So that's what I just thought of when you asked this question, but perhaps it's more of a vector than it is a direct disease itself.
Yeah, so someone else is chiming here about romaine lettuce. Yeah, so you guys are right. foodborne illness, which we will actually talk about in a couple of slides. Foodborne illness is a huge disease burden in terms of pathogen spread. However, you're right, because plants aren't really a host to those types of diseases, right? Those diseases we would still classify as more having an environmental host. So that's the reservoir for them. It just so happens that if the water that is used to maybe sustain the lettuce crops, if that water is contaminated because of some environmental reason, then that's usually how the transmission occurs. So it's not so much that the pathogens live in the plant, things like crops. It's more so that that environmental reservoir has been used and contaminated the particular food source. But yeah, that's a really good question. I think there is an outbreak somewhere of E. coli with room. Yeah, unfortunately, the contamination of lettuce seems to be pretty common, especially because of the quantity of water that it requires. And so it's particularly susceptible to contaminated sources of water, unfortunately, and then that might occur. We also talk about this a little bit in the next lecture, so I won't talk your ear off about it just yet, but refrigeration is also a really important aspect or factor that influences disease transmission. So we will also discuss that next week. But yeah, these are great questions, guys. So another important factor is soil. And soil, as you can imagine, is very influenced as well by vegetation, because vegetation decomposes and then it contributes to the soil profile of a given environment, a given location. So it's also really important for microorganisms in terms of what their niche will be. So this particular study was comparing 4 different soils in China. So we had some tropical soils here at the bottom, some subtropical, and then some more temperate, so deciduous as well as coniferous. Now, what they found was that the different soils actually provided different nutrients, different levels of moisture, and that really influenced the quantity and the types of microorganisms that were found there. So what they found was that in some soils, they actually had much more bacteria. In others, the abundance of other pathogens, other microorganisms was much more prevalent. And so the soil can really influence the abundance or the diversity of different species of microorganisms that will be in that environment. And of course, this has repercussions on humans because, as we said, soil, vegetation are really important for crops. And so you can imagine that if we are growing crops in a soil that is maybe contaminated with some bacteria, then that, of course, would be another transmission route for humans in terms of pathogen spread. Another thing is that soil moisture, you can imagine if a particular environment has really wet soil, that maybe it tends to pool in little ponds. This has been known to be a pretty significant factor for the spread of things like West Nile virus, because obviously pooled water in the ground is going to be a great breeding ground for mosquitoes, for that vector to be able to transmit West Nile virus. So that's another important factor to consider. Now, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about parasites, but parasites are a really important pathogen in significant parts of the world, maybe less so in the North American context. But there's 3 main types of parasites. So one is protozoa, one is helminths, and one is ectoparasites. And protozoa and helminths tend to be the ones that are more in the gut, whereas ectoparasites, things like lice and mites, those are more skin. But parasites can enter the human body in many different ways, usually in the fecal oral route, so usually through the ingestion of things like contaminated food or water. And so this is how some parasites end up in people's stomachs, in their guts, in their intestines. But another way that they are actually transmitted is through the soil. So they're, especially in some parts of the world, particularly in rainforest areas, there are soil transmitted helminths, so a type of parasite that live in the soil, and they can actually enter the body through people's bare feet, and then they settle in the gut that way. So this is why it is definitely not a great idea to run around barefooted in a forest. Your risk here is probably quite a bit lower, but in places that are more tropical that maybe have the endemic problem of parasites in the environment, you definitely don't want to be walking around barefoot. You might end up with a parasite infection. So something to keep in mind if you are one of those travelers who maybe goes to more exotic subtropical climates where they exist. Now, what happens when humans are exposed to multiple pathogens? Would this be a concern? Well, as you might imagine, if you are fighting an infection from one pathogen, it tends to have an impact on your immune function. And so it can make you more susceptible to other pathogens. We know that this is the case with tuberculosis, particularly in places in Africa where malaria is endemic. Many people have this sort of double burden between malaria and tuberculosis. And so people that have been infected with the malarial parasite tend to have worse health outcomes with tuberculosis because it has already impacted their immune system. Now, on the other hand, scientists actually think that co-infection with some parasites isn't always a bad thing. So in this particular study that this graph was from, they were studying these co-infections among people who lived in Bolivia, where many parasites are endemic. And they found that there was this relationship between helminths and another parasite called Giardia. And they found that if you were infected with one, it tended to actually serve as a sort of barrier to getting infected with the other. And so most people were only infected with one or the other. They weren't usually infected with both. So they hypothesized that actually having an infection with some parasite might be beneficial because it might eliminate your potential to be infected with other potentially worse parasites. So that's what they think could be happening in that part of the world. So interesting to note. Now, this brings us to a bit of a discussion on foodborne disease transmission, because of course, this is really, really dependent on many abiotic environmental factors. So as we talked about, of course, vegetation being one of them, soil being another, things like rainfall, even if the rainfall ends up collecting contaminants from a farm where livestock is, then those could wash into a crop field. And again, that might lead to an outbreak of some pathogen. So there's many, many ways that abiotic environmental factors would influence the spread of foodborne diseases. Now, I thought this was an interesting figure because it does show just the unequal burden of these types of diseases, right? Even though foodborne illnesses can break out anywhere in the world, in fact, many of us have probably had a bout of food poisoning at some point in our lives. But overall, the burden is significantly higher in places where systems aren't in place to really help keep food fresh, keep food safe for longer. So places like Africa, the Middle East as well, and Southeast Asia are particularly susceptible to foodborne pathogens. Now, we've spent most of this time talking about how abiotic factors influence pathogens, but how do they influence vectors? Well, it's a little bit more complicated when you think about vectors, because vectors are a species of animal, so things like mosquitoes, ticks, fleas, and as you can imagine, different types of factors will influence them quite differently. So rain might be a good thing for something like mosquitoes, right? Especially if climate change brings about more rain events, then there's the potential that mosquitoes might find more breeding grounds and might actually be more of an important disease vector, even more so than they currently are. On the other hand, if something like climate change brings droughts and periods of dryness, then that could influence mosquitoes in the opposite way. It could actually reduce their abundance and their ability to spread pathogens. Temperature as well is a really important one. This is particularly true for something like ticks. So the warmer it is, the more that ticks can actually spread north, and we'll talk a little bit about that in an upcoming slide. As well, their migration, because many vectors can move, especially something like a mosquito is not isolated to one particular region. They tend to migrate, they tend to travel large distances, and so they can actually spread pathogens pretty substantially in that way. Now, another important piece of migration is human migration. So even over the course of human history, the fact that we have migrated population-wise to new continents, to new parts of the world, we've been exposed to new pathogens in new parts of the world, new ecosystems. So scientists think that this has actually led to the emergence of quite a few different well-known pathogens over time. So something like malaria, tuberculosis, they actually have found evidence that those pathogens existed, thousands and thousands of years ago. They have found them even in tissues from mummies from ancient Egypt. So they know that something like malaria has been with us for a really long period of time. Some other ones are a little bit more recent. So something like AIDS that really only emerged in the last 40 to 50 years. So as humans move, as we encounter new species, especially, that tends to really speed up the process of these emergent pathogens and how they might impact human health. Now, another species that migrate are birds. So do you guys think that birds could spread pathogens globally? What do you guys think? I'm seeing an overwhelming yes. Yeah. So the answer there is yes. We know that they are capable of that, but scientists were pretty interested to know just to what extent. So what they think in this particular study, they were studying domesticated poultry farms in China, so chicken farms, and they were wondering whether the spread of pathogens could go from domesticated animals to other domesticated animals, whether wild bird species were the ones that could potentially introduce pathogens, or whether some combination of the different types. And so what they found that although, yes, wild bird species do have the potential to bring pathogens to domesticated chicken farms, they actually saw that the potential for pathogen emergence was significantly higher between domestic farms to other domestic farms. And this is because of the trade of chickens that tends to happen on regional scales, not just in China, but in many places where farms have agreements and they might trade with one another for different stocks of chickens. And so this can actually introduce the potential for the spread of things like avian flu, right? Avian flu is one of those pathogens that infectious disease experts were really kind of holding their breath, waiting to see if there would be an outbreak of that. For years and years, they've been calling for an outbreak of avian flu to happen. And this is mostly because the increase in demand for chicken as sort of a leaner, healthier meat has really skyrocketed the need to create these kind of factory farm settings for chickens. And obviously, the closer that you have chickens cooped up in a particular farm, the more likely that the spread of pathogens might occur just because of the sheer density of those chickens being together. So in short, yes, birds are definitely a really, really important species to consider anytime we are talking particularly about livestock pathogens. So naturally, this brings us to a discussion on agriculture, because agriculture has definitely changed the way that humans interact with animals, as well as the changes to the overall landscape because of farming. So one way is, again, the consumption of animal products. So not only are we at risk when we consume potentially, uncooked red meat from E. coli, but also just the increase in consumption of certain meats like chicken has driven up the need to create these less safe settings for farming in some places where we might see an increased risk of those pathogen spreads just because of how they are kept together, how they are domesticated. As well, contact with livestock. This has been a really, really important source of pathogens over the course of human history for as long as we've been using agriculture. So things like smallpox actually originated, they think, in animal livestock, and a host of other diseases that they think have originated originally in livestock, which then crossed over to the human boundary. And as well, changes to habitats. So changes to habitats, as you can imagine, might reduce biodiversity, because if you're shrinking the ecosystem around it just to create fields of crops, that obviously has impacts on the species, the biodiversity of the species in the ecosystem. And what did we learn? Well, we learned that less biodiversity generally means an increase of risk for the spread of pathogens. So that's another important point. This brings us to climate change, another really important human change to the landscape. And so the warming climate has some pretty obvious impacts on things like habitat loss, as well as host species dynamics, because if you have less habitats that are suitable because of climate change, then overall that would probably drive down biodiversity in many ecosystems. This has obvious impacts as well on the presence of vectors. So what they think will happen in places like Southern Ontario is that as it gets warmer, the suitable range, so the ecological niche of ticks is going to expand. And we know that ticks are significant carriers of Lyme disease, particularly in the northeastern regions of the US. And so as those ticks migrate from those areas where Lyme disease is already pretty prevalent, we're seeing more and more cases of Lyme disease entering Southern Ontario, as well as Quebec and other parts of Canada, where they think that climate change will unfortunately accelerate this to some extent. Now, there's less obvious impacts on pathogens. So I am going to talk on the next slide a little bit about this one case study I came across, but full disclosure, I came across this in a podcast called Fungus Among Us from Radiolab, and it was back in September. So if you're interested in what I'm about to start talking about on the next slide, by all means, go find the original podcast because they'll explain it in much more detail than I'm unfortunately able to cover in a lecture, but just something to keep in mind. So Candida auris is a fungal infection, and it appeared almost simultaneously on multiple continents around the same time, back in the sort of 2013 to 2016 time period. And what they found was that each was genetically distinct. So it was unlikely that this was just a case of human travelers bringing the fungus to various parts of the world. They all just seemed to emerge sporadically around the same time. Now, why were they worried about this? Can't they just prescribe some antibiotic? Well, what they found was that these fungal infections were actually really, really difficult to treat. They weren't responding very well to treatments, and they had a pretty significant case fatality rate. And so they were worried about why this was happening. So remember that humans are usually really good at resisting diseases from fungal infections because of our body temperature, but not this one. This one seemed to evade the natural barrier of our body temperature. They seem to be able to do well, even in a setting like 36, 37 degrees Celsius inside the human body. So why was this? Well, they realized that because of things like climate change, right, because of the overall warming climate, they think that over the course of time, the fungus will just end up naturally evolving, right? They'll have evolutionary advantages for particular traits that allow them to resist higher and higher temperatures. And so as some of these types of fungus get naturally more acclimatized to warmer temperatures, they might actually be able to spread to humans much more easily because they'll no longer have that advantage, that barrier in our bodies. Our bodies will end up being a similar enough temperature for them to actually invade and cause an infection. So this is a emergent threat that I think is pretty new. Scientists haven't even been aware that this potential threat could happen, but it's definitely going to be one to watch in the upcoming future. So in the last minute or so of lecture, I'm just going to go through this last couple of slides. So urbanization as well, we can imagine, has impacted disease ecology in numerous ways. It has changed the impact. And usually we would think that it would have an impact such that it would lower biodiversity, which could then increase the rate of infectious disease spread. But what they've actually found is that because of changes to things like sanitation and our living environments, the impacts of urbanization are a little bit trickier to narrow down in terms of whether they increase or decrease the risk of infectious disease. So overall, scientists actually think that it's likely that it has decreased the risk. Now, I just want to end today's lecture with this graph here. And I think it summarizes some of these really important ecological as well as landscape factors that have influenced, in this case, zoonotic diseases, but even overall infectious diseases. So almost half of all zoonotic diseases reflect changes in land use and agricultural, human kind of changes to the landscape. And so, it has been a significant driver of infectious disease over time. Now, next week, we will continue talking about infectious diseases. We'll talk about the history of infectious diseases, as well as some of those other factors that have driven increases and decreases in pathogen spread. So I will end it there. And as usual, let me know if you guys have any questions. I can stick around for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week. Bye, everybody.